Hello, I'm Sensei Alex Kakio. Thank you for joining me for Dharma Sunday, where I take canonical Buddhist teachings and tie them with everyday life. The title of today's talk is Science Mostly Agrees with Buddhism, and I Don't Care. Before we get into that, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. That way you'll be notified when I post talks in the future. If you wouldn't mind hitting the like button, that'd be great too. So today's reading comes from Wired.com. It's written by David DeSteno, and it's entitled Psychologists Are Learning What Religion Has Known for Years. And then there's the subtitle, Social Scientists Are Researching What Humans Can Do to Improve Their Quality of Life. Their findings echo what religious practices perfected centuries ago. There's also a line here. Apparently, this article was adapted from a book also written by David DeSteno called How God Works, The Science Behind the Benefits of Religion. Never read the book, but it sounds fascinating, so I may check it out one of these days. But let's get into it. Even though I was raised Catholic for most of my adult life, I didn't pay religion much heed. Like many scientists, I assumed it was built on opinion, conjecture, or even hope, and therefore irrelevant to my work. That work is running a psychology lab focused on finding ways to improve the human condition, using the tools of science to develop techniques that can help people meet the challenges life throws at them. But in the 20 years since I began this work, I've realized that much of what psychologists and neuroscientists are finding about how to change people's beliefs, feelings, and behaviors, how to support them when they grieve, how to help them be more ethical, how to let them find connection and happiness echoes ideas and techniques that religions have been using for thousands of years. Science and religion have often been at odds, but if we remove the theology, views about the nature of God, the creation of the universe, and the like from the day-to-day practice of religious faith, the animosity in the debate evaporates. What we're left with is a series of rituals, customs, and sentiments that are themselves the results of experiments of sorts. Over thousands of years, these experiments, carried out in the messy thick of life, as opposed to sterile labs, have led to the design of what we might call spiritual technologies. Tools and processes meant to soothe, move, convince, or otherwise tweak the mind. And studying these technologies has revealed that certain parts of religious practices, even when removed from a spiritual context, are able to influence people's minds in the measurable ways psychologists often seek. My lab has found, for example, that having people practice Buddhist meditation for a short time makes them kinder. After only 8 weeks of study with a Buddhist Lama, 50% of those who we randomly assigned to meditate daily spontaneously helped a stranger in pain. Only 16% of those who didn't meditate did the same. In reality, the stranger was an actor we hired to use crutches and wear removable foot casts while trying to find a seat in a crowded room. Compassion wasn't limited to strangers, though. It also applied to enemies. Another study showed that after 3 weeks of meditation, most people refrained from seeking revenge on someone who insulted them, unlike most of those who did not meditate. Once my team observed these profound impacts, we began looking for other linkages between our previous research and existing religious rituals. Gratitude, for instance, is something we had studied closely, and a key element of many religious practices. Christians often say grace before a meal. Jews give thanks to God with the Modeh Ani prayer every day upon awakening. When we studied the act of giving thanks, even in a secular context, we found it made people more virtuous. In a study where people could get more money by lying about the results of a coin flip, the majority, 53%, cheated. But that figure dropped dramatically for people who we first asked to count their blessings. Of these, only 27% chose to lie. We've also found that when feeling gratitude to a person, to fate, or to God, people became more helpful, more generous, and even more patient. Even more subtle actions like moving together in time can exert a significant effect on the mind. We see synchrony in almost every religion the world over. Buddhists and Hindus often chant together in prayer. Christians and Muslims regularly kneel and stand in unison during worship. Jews often sway or shukle when reciting prayers together. These actions belie a deep purpose, creating connection. To see how it works, we asked pairs of strangers to sit across a table from one another, put on headphones, and then tap a sensor on the table in front of them each time they heard a tone. For some of these pairs, the sequence of tones matched, meaning they'd be tapping their hands in unison. For others, they were random, meaning hand movements wouldn't be synchronized. Afterward, we created a situation where one member of each pair got stuck doing a long and difficult task. Not only did those who had been moving their hands in unison report feeling more connection with and compassion for their partner, who was now toiling away, 50% of them decided to lend their partner a hand, a big increase over the 18% who decided to help without having just moved in sync. The combined effects of simple elements like these, ones that change how we feel, what we believe, and who we can depend on, accumulate over time. And when they've embedded in religious practices, research has shown they can have protective properties of sorts. Regularly taking part in religious practices lessens anxiety and depression, increases physical health, and even reduces the risk of early death. These benefits don't come simply from general social contact. There's something specific to spiritual practices themselves. The ways these practices leverage mechanisms of our bodies and mind can enhance the joys and reduce the pains of life. Parts of religious mourning rituals incorporate elements science has recently found to reduce grief. Healing rites contain elements that can help our bodies heal themselves simply by strengthening our expectations of a cure. Religions didn't just find these psychological tweaks and nudges long before scientists arrived on the scene, but often packaged them together in sophisticated ways that the scientific community can learn from. The surprise my colleagues and I felt when we saw evidence of religion's benefits was a sign of our hubris, born of a common notion among scientists. All of religion is superstition and therefore could have little practical benefit. I'll admit that we're unlikely to learn much about the nature of the universe or the biology of disease from religion. But when it comes to finding ways to help people deal with issues surrounding birth and death, morality and meaning, grief and loss, it would be strange if thousands of years of religious thought didn't have something to offer. Over the past few years, as I've looked back at the results of my studies and those of other researchers, I've come to see a nuanced relationship between science and religion. I now view them as two approaches to improving people's lives that frequently complement each other. It's not that I've suddenly found faith or have a new agenda to defend religion. I firmly believe that the scientific method is a wonder and offers one of the best ways to test ideas about how the world works. Like any good scientist, I'm simply following the data without prejudice, and it's humbling. Rather than scoffing at religion and starting psychological investigations from scratch, we scientists should be studying rituals and spiritual practices to understand their influence and, where appropriate, create new techniques and therapies informed by them. Doing this doesn't require accepting a given theology, just an open mind and an attitude of respect. Not doing it risks betraying our principles. If we ignore that body of knowledge, if we refuse to take these spiritual technologies seriously as a source of ideas and inspiration to study, we slow the progress of science itself and limit its potential to benefit humanity. It's by talking across the boundaries that we usually divide us, science versus religion, one faith versus another, that we'll find new ways to make life better. So, again, that's at wired.com, written by David DeSeno. Psychologists are learning what religion has known for years is the title. And I think that's incredibly well written. I actually agree with a lot of what he said, despite the title of this Dharma talk. So what I'd like to do is first tell you about my relationship with science, and then I'll explain to you why I do believe that there, like the author states, can and should be a healthy relationship and an interplay between science and Buddhism and religion in general. However, I don't look to science for the truth of Buddhist practice or to find the worth of Buddhist practice. Now, for me personally, I fell in love with science in fourth grade. I won the science fair based on something I did around the human respiratory system. So I had one of those 3-panel poster boards up, and I did hand drawings with crayons of the human lungs and the alveoli, and I explained how the alveoli wave in the lungs and transfer oxygen from our lungs into the blood system, etc. And it was terrific because I had this body and I was learning to ask and answer questions about how it worked. I was learning about the scientific method. And my love of science continued throughout my life to this day. I was reading earlier about the soil requirements to help plants grow. Science is what allows me to know how my cell phone works. It teaches me how to properly care for my plants and my animals. So science is terrific in a secular standpoint and in a somewhat religious context as well. That's why, in addition to being empowered as a Buddhist lay minister, I'm also certified as a mindfulness meditation teacher and as a certified breathwork facilitator. Now, those trainings were very secular, very science-based, which is why when we do our guided meditations on Wednesdays, I'm able to talk about the breathing and how breathing in certain ways calms us down versus other ways speeds up our heart rate. Why I understand the relationship between our prefrontal cortex and our amygdala and how that works. So I want to be very clear. I'm not saying science is bad or that we shouldn't care about what science has to say. Like the author stated, David DeSteno, in the text, I do believe that there's a lot of good scientific backing for why we do what we do in Buddhism. However, I think it's dangerous to have science be the end-all and be-all of religious practice. Primarily, I believe this because science is by its nature secular and it's materialistic, meaning it has to do with the things we can see, that we can taste, that we can touch, etc. There's a certain empiricism in science based solely off of the physical phenomenal world. And while I think that's useful and great, the purpose of Buddhism is not to answer questions about science. I don't look at science to figure out how my laptop is working or how I can fix it when it's broken. The purpose of Buddhism is not historical. I don't read the sutras because I'm looking for a historical text. And frankly, if proof came out tomorrow that the Buddha never existed, frankly, it would have very little impact on my practice because, again, I don't look to the sutras for history. The reason I study the sutras, the reason I practice Buddhism, is it provides me, and I hope you as well, with ontological and metaphysical truths that we can use to live our lives more freely, more kindly, with more compassion, and with more wisdom. And when we talk about metaphysics, scientists and secularists in general often kind of scoff at that. If I can't see it, taste it, touch it, etc., then it doesn't matter, and we shouldn't use it in our daily lives. But the fact is, even if we look at the secular world, there are some metaphysical truths, some ontological truths that can't be proven by science, but we still use them and base our society around them. For example, if we look at the Declaration of Independence, it starts with this sentence: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, those are powerful words. important words, but they're not scientific. The fact is, if we set up a scientific study to measure one person against the other, we'd find that people actually are very unequal. That some people are taller and some people are shorter. Some people run faster, some people run slower, some people are smarter, some people are not so smart. So if we were strictly using a scientific, materialistic view of the world to make our decisions, it would probably not go well for most of us. This idea that all people are created equal is a metaphysical truth. It's an ontological truth. It's a statement about the nature of reality that's not necessarily based on what we can see, taste, touch, etc. Rather, it's based on how we choose to live our lives. When our founders built this country, in theory at least, if not in practice, they were building it on the idea that all people are equal, that there's something intangible about us, something that's not materialistic, that entitles us to those rights that I mentioned earlier in the sentence. Now, that being the case, when we look at the metaphysical claims of Buddhism, we find much the same thing. In Mahayana Buddhism, the central ontological principle, the most important metaphysical teaching, if you will, is the fact that all beings are Buddha. That all beings have a nature that is pure and enlightened. And it's only that because that Buddha nature is covered over by defilements that we misbehave. Now, that's not something I can prove to you with science. There's no material evidence to say that my houseplants are Buddha, or my cats are Buddha, or that I'm Buddha. That is something metaphysical. That is something ontological that we have to hold to if we want to practice Buddhism. And it plays out with very real effects in daily life, just like if I were to say all men are created equal. That has real lasting effects in daily life. We also need to recognize the fact that if we live our lives on a purely secular, materialistic, scientific standpoint, there are very real limits to that, especially when we talk about things like morality. What is the scientific reason that says that I should care for my neighbor who is sick? Now, we can say we should do it because our neighbor is Buddha, but that's a religious argument. We can say we should do it because we're all interconnected, but from a materialistic standpoint, that falls apart pretty quickly. If I'm a billionaire and I can pay for my own house and my own food and my own water, I'm not really that connected to the people around me, at least on the surface. We know differently in Buddhism, but on the surface, in the material realm, I'm good. I don't need to care for others. So if we want to build a lasting morality, we can't build it based off of science. We can't base it off of materialism. That, again, is a metaphysical and ontological claim. That's something that religion does quite well, that Buddhism does quite well. So I believe when we are talking about the science of religion and the science of faith, I think it's good, I think it's interesting, but I think it's dangerous to say, I only practice meditation because of this scientific study over here. I only chant because of this other scientific study over there. Because what that does is it discounts 2,600 years of research that has already been done by Buddhist theologians and scholars and teachers, and we're essentially starting over from scratch, rebuilding the wheel unnecessarily and suffering in the meantime, just so that we can end up where we started. So I personally am of the viewpoint that everyone should kind of know their lane. As a Buddhist teacher, it is not my job to teach you about science. It's not my job to teach you about history, though there's some Buddhist history that I'll mention here and there. Rather, it's to teach you about the metaphysical and ontological claims that Buddhism makes that will help you in daily life. And the job of scientists is to study things like religion and tell us about the material world and how it works and how we can build houses better and what's the proper way to construct a bridge so it doesn't collapse. But we have to understand that there are metaphysical and ontological truths that science, frankly, just isn't built to deal with, because it is materialistic, because it is empirical, because it deals solely with the things we can touch, taste, smell, etc. Now, that being said, I'm not saying that we should practice Buddhism untested. The Buddha was very clear that we should test everything, including his teachings. I'm simply arguing that science isn't necessarily the only or the best way to do that. So how do we test the Dharma? How do you know I'm teaching you things that are helpful versus things that will hurt you? How do you know I'm not full of crap? How do you know the Buddha's not full of crap? Well, in part, we can look at the fact that the longevity of the teachings, for me personally, the fact that people have been doing these practices, the bowing, the chanting, the meditating, for 2,600 years would suggest to me that, well, there must be something to this, right? We can also look at the example of our teachers. Are they calmer? Are they more relaxed? Are they wise and compassionate? And if they're not, well, first, you should probably get a new teacher. But secondly, that would be a suggestion, well, maybe these practices don't work the way they're saying that they're working. Maybe the way they practice isn't a good fit for me. And finally, we can test the Buddha Dharma in the laboratory of our own lives. And that should be the real kicker, not what science says, not what I say, not what the Buddha says. What happens in your daily life? If you meditate daily, are you more kind to your friends and neighbors? If you practice gratitude, chanting Nembutsu, Namo Amida Butsu, does that help your feelings of greed, anger, ignorance in your mind? I don't bow or chant because the Buddha said I have to. I do the traditional Buddhist practices, the bowing, the chanting, the meditating, the sutra study, because after nearly a decade, I know from experience they've made my life richer. I know I'm more forgiving now than I was 10 years ago. I know my anger doesn't last as long as it used to. I know from family and my friends that I'm easier to be around. That I don't blow up as easily. That I don't hold on to grudges. So again, I'm a big believer in science. I think it has so much to offer our world. The only reason I can give this talk to you is because of science and the scientific method. However, we must not fall into the trap of thinking that science is the only way to test the Dharma, or even the best way. This is especially true when we read the sutras and read things that may not make sense from a scientific perspective. I remember especially in a conversation I had on Facebook where someone asked me, do you think that Buddha really flew? And he was trying to make the argument that if things can't be proven scientifically through empiricism, see, touch, taste, etc., then we should get rid of it. The bodhisattvas, the devas, these things aren't useful because there's no scientific evidence for their existence. And I don't agree with that. And I don't agree with that because there are two reasons we should be reading the sutras, and they have nothing to do with science. Again, Buddhism is not here to teach you science. Rather, the sutras are there to be proof text. They tell us what the Buddha taught, so they give us the doctrinal teachings, and they're also models of behavior. So like we read Aesop's fables, the tortoise and the hare, and that story about the tortoise winning the race because slow and steady versus the rabbit choosing to take a nap. Did the tortoise literally beat the hare? Probably not. Does it matter? No. Because the message of the story is a model of behavior. Slow and steady wins the race. The Buddhist sutras are the same. They're not there to be scientific. They're proof texts or they're models of behavior. So when we read about the Buddhas, about the Devas, about the Bodhisattvas, about Vimalakirti leaving a heaven realm to come to this world to teach the Dharma out of compassion for all sentient beings, the question that arises in my mind isn't what's the scientific evidence of a heaven realm. The question that arises in my mind is how can I be compassionate like Vimalakirti? How can I reach the point where I'm willing to leave heaven to save other sentient beings from suffering? So again, we test the Dharma, we test Buddhism, but we don't necessarily use science to do that, though science can be helpful. We use our own lives, our own mind, and our own experience to figure what the teachings can do for us. And if we find that they're lacking, that they don't work as advertised, then we let them go. But if we do find that they make us more compassionate and more wise, more forgiving, more peaceful in our daily lives, well, that's great too. Amitabha. So that's the talk for today. I hope it was helpful. I'll just end with a few announcements. So this was Dharma Sunday. It happens every Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's broadcast right here at this channel. If you'd like to join us on Wednesday for meditation and sutra study, that's also broadcast here every Wednesday, 6:30 p.m. Eastern. And it's a little bit more involved. 15-minute guided meditation, a reading from a Buddhist sutra, and then I give a Dharma talk. So, if you like, I hope to see you there. Until next time, Amitabha.